What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our quarterback rankings for week 12 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, number one overall, I've got Patrick Mahomes going up against the Rams on Sunday. Patty Mahomes is your quarterback number one in fantasy football at the moment. He is playing absolutely lights out. This Chiefs offense under head coach Andy Reid with Patrick Mahomes at the helm does not look like it has skipped a beat whatsoever. They look like possibly the best team in the entire AFC. Patrick Mahomes, 27.4 points in week 11, 329 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 23 yards on the ground. Since week 4 of the season, Patrick Mahomes has had 21 or more fantasy points every single game of the week. I was really close to going with Josh Allen at number one overall because of the matchup against the Lions, but I'm keeping Patrick Mahomes, our QB1 so far on the season, at number one overall. I think he has a field day against the Rams. All right, talking about Josh Allen, I've got him number 2 overall playing on Thanksgiving Day against the Lions. He has been limited throughout the week, but I do think he'll be good to go. Kind of an underwhelming performance last week. Definitely his most disappointing game of the season against the Browns in week 11. 12.5 fantasy points, 197 passing yards, and 1 touchdown. He did add 7 rushing yards, but that doesn't really account for anything. So I do think that Josh Allen will bounce back. Don't get me wrong, I'm not worried about Allen whatsoever. It's a beautiful matchup. He'll be good to go. He'll put up a solid stat line. Don't lose faith if you're an Allen owner. He absolutely deserves to be number 2 on the list overall. All right, third on the list, I've got Jalen Hurts, who does come in as your quarterback number 3 so far on the season. 24.2 points against the Colts in week 11, 190 passing yards, a touchdown, 86 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. Even if it feels like the Eagles offense has taken a little bit of a step back in the past few weeks, Jalen Hurts still has at least 20 fantasy points in all of his performances in the last 3 weeks. This should be a good competitive game script against the Green Bay Packers, who just got absolutely torched essentially by the Tennessee Titans. So I like Jalen Hurts in this matchup, no doubt about it. All right, Joe Burrow is your quarterback 5 so far on the season. He had a monster day in week 11, his 3rd best fantasy performance on the season. 28.7 points against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 355 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns. Guys, he might be getting Jamar Chase back against the Titans here in week 12. We all know that this secondary is absolutely awful. Don't get me wrong, the Tennessee Titans have a good run defense. They have a good pass rush, but I do think that Burrow is going to be able to put up a very good stat line against this Tennessee Titans team. He's going to have Boyd. He's going to have Higgins no matter what. He's going to have Mixon and Hurst, and he could potentially be getting his favorite pass catcher back in Jamar Chase. So I think Burrow is going to have a very solid week overall. All right, number 5 overall, I've got Justin Fields, but he gets a little bit of an asterisk, right? We all know the story here. He is questionable to go for week 12. Essentially played through a shoulder injury, maybe another injury in week 11 against the Atlanta Falcons, but still finished with 23.6 fantasy points, 153 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 85 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. I think that Fields, if he is good to go, will have a good enough stat line against the Jets that he still has to be in the top 5 conversations. A tough matchup, I get it, guys, and we also don't know if Fields is going to be able to play, but there's no way with the way he has performed since week 5 of the season that I'm not going to mention Justin Fields in the top 5 as we approach week 12. All right, next up on the list, we've got Tua Time facing the Houston Texans. He should be able to put together a nice stat line. Since week 8 of the season, he's had 23 or more fantasy points in all of his matchups on bye week in week 11. So not a lot to go off here, but we do know that this Miami Dolphins offense is absolutely humming. He's got some of the best playmakers in all of the league. Tua's going to have a good stat line. He is definitely a player for you guys to start as we approach the week. Next up, I've got Lamar Jackson coming in as your quarterback number 6 so far on the season. He gets the Jacksonville Jaguars. Guys, there's been a lot of panic around Lamar Jackson, and I absolutely understand if you were worried about Jackson. I thought he would have a much better week in week 11 against the Panthers, but just 16.4 fantasy points, 209 passing yards, no touchdowns, an interception, 31 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. So no passing touchdowns on the day. I just really feel like Lamar Jackson does not have enough support around him. The defense is good, but outside of the run game at times and Mark Andrews, not like he has a very consistent wide receiver 1. Demarcus Robinson has stepped up for him. I just really feel like Lamar Jackson needs more playmakers around him. Ultimately, he can't do everything, but we know the talent that Jackson brings to the table. He is still a top tier quarterback. He is still a quarterback who brings far too high of a ceiling to sit, unless you have, maybe a bench player like Geno Smith, who gets the Raiders this weekend in a phenomenal matchup overall. Geno Smith comes in as your quarterback 7 so far on the season, even with being on bye week in week 11. So in his last 3 performances, he's had 19 or more fantasy points. Geno Smith is absolutely a quarterback at this point in the season that we can trust as a quarterback 1 for our fantasy rosters, and he gets a beautiful matchup against the Raiders. All right, number 9 overall, I've got Justin Herbert. I begged you guys to give Justin Herbert one last chance in week 11 against the Kansas City Chiefs, and he definitely rewarded us. Depending on your scoring format, he had at least 20 fantasy points, 280 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and interception towards the end of the game to wrap things up for the Chiefs, but ultimately a much better stat line than what we have seen. We know that Mike Williams re-aggravated his ankle, but Keenan Allen is back out there, and Josh Palmer played the best football game of his whole season. So it looks like Herbert does have the weapons around him, and when he has those weapons around him, healthy, he is going to have a good performance overall. So I like Herbert against a Cardinals team that is definitely struggling at this point in the season, that just got absolutely lit up by the San Francisco 49ers. So Herbert comes in as your quarterback 11 on the season. I like him as our QB9 heading into week 12 of the season. Next up, I've got Dak Prescott going up against the Giants on Thanksgiving Day. 20.6 fantasy points for Prescott in week 11 against the Vikings, 276 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Prescott is just playing very consistent football right now. Since he's come back from injury, we kind of had the lag week in week 7, his first game back, but since week 8, he's had 20 or more fantasy points in all of his matchups. I think Prescott absolutely deserves to be quarterback 10 as we approach week 12 of the season. All right, number 11 overall, I've got Kyler Murray going up against the Chargers. Kyler Murray still coming in as your quarterback 8 so far on the season, even with missing his last 2 games. Now, we don't know if Kyler's going to be good to go, dealing with a hamstring injury on Sunday. And it's worth noting that the Cardinals are on bye week in week 13, so there is a chance that Kyler sits in week 12 and sits through the bye week and returns in week 14 against the New England Patriots. But if Kyler does play, although he's had some struggles on the season, and the Cardinals as a whole have had some injuries and some struggles in general, Kyler still brings too good of a ceiling and a safe enough floor that he cannot be out of the top 12 as we approach week 12 of the season. All right, next up on the list, I've got Trevor Lawrence squaring up against the Baltimore Ravens. Listen, I do think this Ravens defense is looking vastly improved up front, but I do also believe this is going to be a game where the Jaguars are going to be playing from behind, and Trevor Lawrence will be forced to throw the football quite a bit. So I like Lawrence. He's your quarterback 13 on the season. He had 20.9 fantasy points against the Kansas City Chiefs in week 10, was on bye week in week 11. I don't see a crazy high ceiling here, but I think that Lawrence has a good opportunity in a game script that favors him, and against a secondary that has been allowing for a lot of points to the wide receiver position. Next up, I've got Tom Brady going up against the Cleveland Browns. This might be a little bit high for Brady, but I just have a feeling he's going to have a good game. Showed a lot of promise in week 10, at least, looking at the rest of the season, showed a lot of promise. 17 fantasy points, 258 passing yards, and 2 passing touchdowns. So I think that Brady could put together another safe floor. Not the highest ceiling, but as we've cracked into kind of the last tier of quarterbacks here, you're not going to see a lot of high ceilings. Aaron Rodgers is your quarterback 12 on the season. I've got him as our QB 14 due to the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, but in his last 2 games, he's had 19 or more fantasy points. So he is somewhat improving on the season. He had 3 passing touchdowns in week 10. He had 2 in week 11. He had at least 224 passing yards in both of those games. Looking at the rest of Rodgers' season, those are his 2 best fantasy performances. So I am of the belief that he can definitely continue this quote-unquote hot streak, but it is a tough matchup against the Eagles. All right, 15th overall, I've got Danny Dimes going up against the Cowboys. He's your quarterback 10 on the season, had 18.2 points in week 10, and had his best fantasy performance of the season in week 11 against the Lions with 26.6 fantasy points, 341 passing yards, which was a season high, a touchdown, 2 interceptions, 50 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. But he gets the Dallas Cowboys, a tough matchup, so he's a little bit further back on the list. I am of the belief that the Giants are good enough to make this game competitive. I'm still going to give the nod to the Cowboys, especially the Cowboys defense at the end of the day. I do think that Daniel Jones can hang in there and make this a competitive enough game script that he definitely deserves to be ranked as quarterback 15, being that he's quarterback 10 so far on the season. All right, looking at our final 5 quarterbacks, I'm not going to break them down as extensively, but we'll go through them very quickly here. These are guys that you're basically just streaming if you don't have better options. Captain, you like that? Kirk Cousins is our quarterback 16 going into the week, our quarterback 14 overall on the season after an abysmal performance in week 11, not just by Kirk Cousins, but by this entire Minnesota Vikings offense. 2.2 fantasy points against the Dallas Cowboys in week 11. Just 105 passing yards off of 23 passing attempts with 12 completions. A very bad day for Kirk Cousins, and he gets a stout matchup against the New England Patriots, so he is pretty far back on the list, although he was playing at a pretty high level, all things considered beforehand, so he definitely deserves to still be in the top 20, but tough matchup this week and did not look so good last week. I do think he'll bounce back in comparison to last week, but it is a tough matchup against the Patriots. All right, next up, I've got Matt Ryan going up against the Steelers. This is a good matchup for Matty Ice. He looked good in week 10 with 22.6 fantasy points, and then came back to earth against the Philadelphia Eagles with just 8.6 fantasy points. So I do think that Matt Ryan against a Pittsburgh Steelers team that has a good front seven, but a very weak overall secondary, and I don't even know if they had that great of a front seven. They just have TJ Watt, right? So point being, I do think that Matt Ryan has an opportunity here against the Steelers secondary, and I do think that he deserves to be in the top 20. So we'll put Matt Ryan as number 17 overall. All right, moving along, I've got Jimmy Garoppolo as your quarterback 18. You could definitely argue at this point that Jimmy G should be a little bit higher. I really don't mind him in front of Kirk Cousins or Matt Ryan. These Saints have played good defense at times on the season, and they played very poor defensively as well. That being said, Jimmy G had 25.4 fantasy points against the Cardinals on Monday Night Football, his best fantasy performance so far on the season. So I actually think that Jimmy Garoppolo should reasonably be a little bit higher on the list. 228 passing yards and 4 touchdowns, but overall on the season on a weekly basis, we usually get somewhere between 15 and 18 fantasy points for Jimmy Garoppolo. So I don't know if I'm quite ready to fully trust him to bring that higher ceiling of 25 fantasy points on a weekly basis. But I'll tell you guys this much, if he does accomplish that against the Saints or have at least 20 fantasy points, he'll definitely be higher up going into the following week against Miami. So I do think that Jimmy Garoppolo is one of the safest streaming options, probably the safest option on this last tier of quarterbacks, but he comes in as 18 overall as we approach the week. All right, 19th overall, I've got Derek Carr going up against the Seahawks. A good matchup for Derek Carr, who had 20.2 fantasy points against the Denver Broncos, 307 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. We saw some life out of this Raiders team in week 11, and I think that they'll continue to show some fight against the Seattle Seahawks. So Carr is a desperate streaming option, but he does have a pretty decent matchup overall. All right, last on the list, I've got Marcus Mariota. Really struggled with the 20th overall quarterback. There are a lot of different options that could have gone here, but ultimately in the last 2 weeks, Marcus Mariota has had 17 or more fantasy points. He's been very inconsistent at times on the season, but he's shown us enough on the season. Coming in as your quarterback number 9 so far on the season, 2 touchdowns in both of his last 2 performances. Listen, it's your 20th overall quarterback. I'm not expecting a ton. Pretty unbelievable to me that Marcus Mariota is quarterback 9 so far on the season. So we'll put him in as quarterback 20 against the Commanders. This Commanders defense looked really good last week, so I'm a little bit wary, but we do know that the secondary is an issue for the Commanders, so there's definitely some opportunity for Marcus Mariota to get it going in the passing game in this matchup as we approach week 12. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. Please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.